Welcome to this video on tips for oral exams. Before we start, I want to make some things clear. The first thing being that this is oral exams I'm talking about. It can to some extent be used for written exams or presentations or things like that, but it's not designed for it. Another thing it's not designed for is university level exams because they tend to have certain requirements and certain settings that I can't really cover in this one video. But the last thing is that it's designed for Danish exams. I'm Danish, I'm a teacher in Denmark, and the original video was meant to help students in Denmark handle their oral exams better. It might be slightly different wherever you are in the world, but a lot of things I've noticed through the years are very similar, at least from country to country. Now, what I'm gonna go through here are 4 pieces of advice for the exam, and it's not really that it's a 1, 2, 3, 4 order or recipe that you need to carry out to the exact specifications. It's more for things that you should think about before entering an exam situation. So let's get started with it. Now, the first one is, well, there's no way to get around it. You need some kind of knowledge. What they're looking for in the exam is typically that you've paid some level of attention and you've attained some level of understanding in whatever subject you're taking the exam in. But this tends to get misunderstood grossly by students because what they're not looking at is whether or not you're a genius. You need to know the basics, but you don't need to present the next big revolutionary idea. It's not a genius recruiting camp, it's just a test to see if you've got the basics down in whatever subject you're dealing with at the exam. And quite often, and sometimes even according to the laws of a country, they're not allowed to greatly reward you for something that is outside of what you have been taught in class. So don't go in there expecting that you have to show that you're the next Einstein or anything. That's not what you're graded on. You're graded on showing a basic level of knowledge, and that's something I will deal with in other videos, how to attain that basic knowledge more efficiently. Now, the second point is easier said than done, to be honest, but keep cool and go on. Now, a lot of people have a tendency to, there's no nice way to say this, a lot of students have the tendency to freak out in exam situation and think that everybody is against them. That's not the case, and in fact, if you need it, then the first point you need to tackle is, as a wise man once wrote, don't panic. If you get nervous in an exam situation, if you start to tremble, if you start to fumble, you're not going to crash and burn on that. If you actually really take damage to your grade from that, your teacher is not a nice person. Most teachers are not that mean. What's really the big thing here is not whether or not you break down, it's whether or not you can go, oh, okay, when something goes wrong, and then just keep things moving instead of having everything fall apart. One of the key points to this that people tend to forget is that the other people in the room with you are not some kind of diabolical aliens who are there to suck out your brains or anything. They're people. They're human beings. They are people who have chosen a career dealing with the subject that you're supposed to talk about, which means that most likely they like the subject to some degree and probably like talking about it. If they get a feeling that you are at the very least okay talking to them about it. That shows a lot about you. That shows that, or at least it gives them the idea that you feel comfortable with the subject and therefore that you can handle the subject, which is basically what they're looking at. As I said, they're not looking for genius. They're looking for someone who can handle the subject that they've been taught for the last probably many years. They're human beings. They just happen to be human beings with an interest in a certain subject that you're now talking about. The third one, the third point, is not something that should be taken out of proportion. It's basically about variation and flexibility. The question is, when you start talking about the subject, are you just quoting the pages because you memorized them, or do you actually have an idea what you're talking about? Now, someone who is strictly quoting pages, who's just read the book and is repeating what it said without ever thinking about it, will have problems explaining things in other ways than what the book does. So logically, if you can explain things in a slightly varied manner, if you can draw some parallels to something, even if they seem a bit corny or if they're not entirely fitted, if you can show that you can think of the subject outside of what the book says, it helps a lot. And it's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, it's like saying, oh, what I just talked about, well, you kind of say that it's like something else. And sometimes a teacher will even try to get you in that direction because the teacher has an idea that you may be able to push for an even better grade by asking you, oh, can you compare that to something? Sometimes it's something that you should be able to compare it to. Then we're back to the basic knowledge. But sometimes they just want to know that you can explain things in a slightly different way than what it says in the book. And if you can sit down with a friend and try to explain them something from the subject of the exam in just two different ways, and make them understand, of course, then you've usually covered that pretty nicely. Again, it's about being relaxed, showing that you got the basic knowledge down, and also showing that you've thought about it instead of just quoting from the book. Now the fourth one is kind of a sad irony. I don't know if it's technically ironic or we're in Alanis Morissette territory or what, but sometimes during an exam, the other people in the room will just start talking. Maybe it's an anecdote, maybe it's some kind of comment on something you said or something another one in the room said. But if the talk starts to go away from the subject at the heart of the exam, some people panic. And as you remember, the trick is don't panic. The people that are in there with you at the exam are human beings. And human beings like to talk, or at least most of them do. And if they start feeling comfortable with the situation, if they start feeling comfortable that you feel comfortable and that you've got at least the basics covered and that you know what you talk about is perhaps a bit too much, but at least that you've thought about what you're talking about rather than just quoting, they may just feel comfortable in your presence. And that might mean that they've decided on your grade already. It might mean that they're stressed out. Remember, they're sitting in there for quite a long time, especially if you're one of the last ones to take the exam that day. And sometimes they just need to relax themselves a bit. In some cases, it means that they are actually feeling that you deserve a respectable grade. And the chit chat is kind of a social thing where if you seem relaxed while it goes on, they may actually give you a better grade. This is not fair. This is not according to some rules. The entire exam situation is an evaluation of how you handle yourself when talking about the subject. And that evaluation is very personal, and it's a lot about psychology. I cannot repeat this enough. It's not fair, but it's fact. If the teachers feel good in your presence, it can affect the grade. As I said before, if you start to get uncomfortable or anything, it's not going to break you. It's not going to break the grade. It's not going to flunk you. But if you can just go, oh, this is what's going on, I'll keep cool with that. It looks good. You present an exterior that kind of shouts, hey, I'm fine with this. I'm not gonna fall apart on you. I feel okay with this, even if I'm not perfect in it. And as in many other social situations outside an exam, people react well to that. So if they start just talking, don't freak out. Follow along a bit, don't press the situation, and for the love of God, don't try to start the talking. Don't try to start to make them chit chat. That's not a good idea, but if it happens, go with the flow, and if you feel up to it, maybe push them a bit back on track. But if you can handle these four things, if you can handle some basic knowledge about the subject you're dealing with, if you can to some extent keep your head and not go into a total panic, and if you can point out things from slightly different perspectives or make an interesting comparison, don't force it, but it helps to have something ready or and have thought about the things. And if you can handle when people in the room start basically relaxing, it can have some really positive influences on your grade, and it can actually have a lot of positive influence on the experience of taking the exam. But again, these are just tips, these are suggestions, these are ideas, and as soon as you just start thinking about them a bit, you'll already start getting at least a few of their advantages. And again, this is based on my experience in Denmark. Might not apply entirely to wherever you're taking your exam, but thinking about it should be worth a try.